Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Francis Shefter, Principal of Shefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.shefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Francis Shefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. So today's guest, Sarah Bobal, is a dyslexia specialist and the owner of Right Start Reading. And I'm really excited about that because dyslexia has been something that has been coming up more and more. And I've been having more and more clients that their kids are dyslexic, and what can I do? What can schools do to support? So Sarah, I would introduce yourself. Tell us why you do what you do. How did you get into being a dyslexia specialist?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I think if I think back to the reason I've really got into this is that I was a reading specialist, right? So I had gone to school to teach reading basically, and you would have thought I would have got all of my credentials and had all the right training and teaching in order to be able to provide the right instruction to students. Um, Unfortunately, for whatever reason, that wasn't exactly the case for the certain types of students that I was working with. And I can think of, regarding my why, one student in particular. And this student, I can remember she was in like seventh or eighth grade. She didn't know her short vowel, like she had made it all the way to seventh or eighth grade. She didn't know her short vowel sounds. There were some consonants she was missing. She couldn't blend. And even though I had spent all of this time, you know, learning about reading instruction, learning how to be a reading teacher, I couldn't believe that. I was like, I don't know what to do to help this student. I am not equipped. And that just can't be because this is my passion. I want to be able to help her. And I just felt so stuck. So basically, I was like, what can I do? How do I get better at this? Just started researching. Like, this was back in 2017. So, like, the science of reading hadn't really, I guess, reached the forefront at that point yet. There wasn't really a lot out there. So, I eventually found my way through the IU. So Pennsylvania has intermediate units or IUs, and I found free Wilson Reading System training for the level one, which is it's a dyslexia. It's a program for dyslexic students, but you can obviously use it for just students who have reading difficulties. It's systematic, sequential, that kind of thing. That was my first introduction to teaching reading in a scientific, more systematic way, and like I said, that was back in 2017, and it kind of just spurred this interest and this passion, just ignited the passion even more because through that program, I was able to help her, and I know I've learned a lot more since then, but
Right.
that initial program, that worked. And once you experience that, where you feel like what you're doing is helping a child that greatly needs help, you don't want to stop doing that. So that's
Right.
my why. So
That's awesome. It's
yeah.
and the fact that you say that, because I have a friend of mine did her master's in reading specialist also and had no special ed training. And I'm like, how could you be a
Right.
reading specialist with no special ed training, right?
Yes, I didn't have
Um,
special ed training either.
right. And it just
I
amazes me because like thinking about like schools and what they do and who, so they have a reading specialist or they have a special ed teacher.
Right.
Special ed teacher usually doesn't have the reading specialist. Reading specialist doesn't know the special ed. And
Mhm.
who's pulling the child out to work on the reading,
Right.
you
Exactly.
know?
They're not communicating, or the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, that sort of thing. I've definitely seen that in schools. It's unfortunate, but
And it's
yeah.
such a challenge. And I know, so I know with dyslexia, there's like the screeners the school does.
Mhm.
What I've found is usually the screeners are not telling the truth.
Mhm.
And what, or I should say not telling the truth. They're not accurate. They're not very accurate. They don't
They're
pick
not
up.
sensitive. Yeah, they're not as
Yeah.
sensitive as maybe they need to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, the other thing that I've seen a lot is that people get ground in that if you're dyslexic, you can't read at all and you can't
Mhm.
pass the tests.
Yeah.
And So it's a challenge for getting a child, an IEP for dyslexia
Mhm.
because, the discrepancy model, usually that's not a discrepancy.
Mhm. Right.
Right, but the problem is that when kids are tested, they're tested on reading fluency, then they're
Yeah.
tested on reading words, then they're tested on comprehension. And a dyslexic child can usually do all three,
Right.
but
Yeah.
not when you put them all together,
Well, I was
right?
thinking about that too because so many of the parents that I've talked to that they find me through whatever means, usually an Orton-Gillingham list or something. Someone's recommended, that specific approach to them, but they'll come and they'll tell me their stories about, well, I'm really trying to get help for my son, but, or daughter, whatever, they have average reading scores. So the school isn't, offering to help them, but I know that they're struggling. There's some kind of missing link there, and I don't know what to do. And then of course, the discrepancy model. And I had thought, of course, in various trainings I've done, we've talked about this, how that's not the best way, obviously,
Right.
to get help to the students who really need it, and I didn't realize that there were so many schools that still use that. In fact, I think the school district that I taught in previously, does still use that model, um, and
Yeah,
it's really good.
I was at a meeting and when I said something about using the discrepancy model, the psychologist like, well, that's archaic. And I'm like, you're
Yeah.
calling me old. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not very
Right.
nice. But
No.
like it is, but it isn't. But like that, and that was one,
Mhm.
like what I've done is that if you look at the base scores, you usually don't have the discrepancy. But once you go into the
Right.
subtests,
Mhm.
and a lot of times the schools don't report all the subtests. But
Mhm.
that's how I was able to get one of my children because the psychologist goes, well, in the subtests, a seven is, one um, standard deviation. A six is
Yeah.
two standard deviation. So a six. So I'm like, so any subtest that is a six means there's a discrepancy and she would qualify. And she
Mhm.
said, yes. I'm like, okay, so look at spelling, decoding, and encoding, and they're
Mhm.
like, oh, they're all six. She qualifies. And the
Yeah.
teacher still would say, no, 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 no. She's reading.
Right.
And I'm like, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, you can say no as much as you want. The data is the data. And so
Yeah.
thankfully we were able to get it. But
Yeah.
the problem is that I know what I've seen at least, and tell me if you've seen something different, is that
Mhm.
our kids with dyslexia are very, very bright and they learn
Mhm.
how to compensate.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it doesn't truly come out until they're hitting the older grades,
Mhm.
third grade, fourth grade, sometimes not even until middle school. And that's
Mhm.
when it's discovered. And the problem is, what I find is that you're not going to get the instruction you need for a dyslexic child in the school system without missing too much curriculum, which is
Mhm.
going to cause a whole nother issue. And so there's
Right.
times I'll tell potential clients, I'm like, look, I can get you a perfect IEP, but that's not going to help your child in the way your child needs to help, right?
Right.
You need a
Yeah.
dyslexic specialist.
Yes. And I've definitely seen the same thing. In fact, a lot of the students or a lot of the parents that have come to me have been parents of older students. And exactly what you said, a lot of like a classic, I mean, you can't really put them all in a box, but I guess you could say like a very typical dyslexic profile would be a student who does struggle with reading and spelling, but who is very bright and has strong oral vocabulary, so they can use those compensating skills to a little bit fake a little bit of their knowledge so that they kind of are hidden under the radar, so to speak,
Right,
and they don't get the help that they need. And really, it's so essential to get that help in the early years because that's when you can make the most impact. And I mean, of course, you can help these students once they get, past grade 3 or whatever, but it's going to take a lot more work. It has to be a lot more intensive, and it takes a lot more time. And I think that unfortunately, that's not something parents always want to hear, but that's the case. And that really starts, I think, with the school systems, especially if you're in a public school system, is having that teacher training or having teachers who have the ability to see what those signs are as early as possible. And like you were saying, the dyslexic screeners, the screeners that they're using may not be as sensitive as they need to be to pick up on some of these students. And I think that's when you have to have a teacher who sees the whole child and recognizes those signs to get them the help that they need as
right.
early as they need it.
And it's even like I've had teachers that teachers know something's wrong, knows
Yeah.
something's up and they see it. And so they have, so they'll mention it to the parents or whatever, and then you have to convince the school to do the testing.
Mhm.
Um, and then it's, do you want to do the school testing or do you want to do your private testing?
Right.
Because, like that's always a battle of what are you going to do, because the school only does so much,
Right.
and doesn't do everything comprehensively as
Yeah.
an independent. Um,
Right, and those tests, those private tests are so expensive. I mean, I don't have
yeah,
my children are young. I'm not, we're not at that stage by any means, and I don't know if they'll have. I don't think that they will, but if they did, I couldn't afford testing like that. I don't know.
right.
For many of these parents, the school system testing is their only option. Um,
Right. And which is fine. It's just,
mhm,
and I always say that start with it. Sometimes we have clients that are lucky that have insurance,
mhm,
but I know here in
right.
Maryland, you're on like a 12 to 18 month waiting list to get into the ones that take insurance.
Yes.
But I mean, I guess the important thing with the school one is that if you know as a parent going in what you're looking at and what you're looking for,
Right.
so that when the school does do the testing, you can then look at the tests and go, "Oh, wait a minute, but what about this? And what about that?"
Right. Yeah, why
And
wasn't
pull
this
it in, right?
included? Or yeah, exactly. And I think that Melissa Farrell does a lot of presentations on assessment. She's written a few books, and part of my teacher training or Orton-Gillingham based training. Those are the books on the list that we have to read. And actually, when I went back to school to Drexel to get my reading specialist certificate because in Pennsylvania, anyway, it's a long story, but I didn't have
Yeah.
my certificate in Pennsylvania. Her books were also on the list of books. So Melissa Farrell, she does wonderful work in that area, and she says, the scores are just the beginning, and all of that nitty gritty stuff where you can really find out where they're really struggling or why they're presenting a certain way. It's all in those subtests, and that's something that we study a lot of in the Orton-Gillingham training, um, to help us say, let's look at this student's testing and let's see where exactly their strengths and needs are, so that we can design an intervention that really targets what they need. Um, so yeah, I think the testing is super important.
And for the parents to know if they're going the school
Mhm.
school route, which of course, is fine, the schools have to, then walking in saying, "I think my child has dyslexia. I want the testing done. I want to make sure we look at all of the subtest scores." Because a lot of
Right.
times schools won't even report the subtests.
Yeah.
So you gotta be specific and say, "I wanna see the subtests.
Yeah.
I wanna see absolutely every little score."
And I don't think unless you had someone like you or someone like a parent isn't going to know that,
Right,
right? I mean,
right,
that's and I wouldn't know that if I wasn't in this field. I mean, you would get what you get, and then you assume that's all that there is, and then,
right.
you know?
And that's a lot of the reason of why I do this show, is to let parents know, like, "Hey, you don't have to have somebody with you, you can, as long as you're armed with the information." And that's what it's all about, is empowering the family, is to be able to go
Yeah,
in and fight. I always
right.
say I wish I didn't have a job, because that meant all schools are doing what they're supposed to be doing and supporting children
Exactly.
appropriately.
Right.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
they don't. And so, here's where I am. So now I just help families. I try to help them without, like, here's some free resources, do it on your
Yeah.
own. If you can, great. If you can't, come back and call me and I got you. We'll get you your child what your child needs to
Yeah.
process it.
You're a great resource to have, I'm sure, for so many parents out there. Like, I think about the parents that come to me too, and they're just looking for help, and guidance. They just
Right.
don't know. So yeah.
Yeah. So, what are some things, like, for any parents that are
Sure.
listening? What are some, like, especially for parents that might have younger kids that aren't quite here yet? What are some, like, best at-home literacy practices? I mean, obviously the reading to your child, but, like,
Yeah.
what are some other things that they could do?
I think that, especially for the youngest ones, of course, like you said, reading to them, building up that oral vocabulary is really huge, and you can't, like, I guess, read like a learning disability. You can't just read and read and read and expect it to resolve itself. I think people know that by now, but it's still a huge benefit for their oral vocabulary, because we know that oral vocabulary facilitates fluency. It facilitates their ability to, if they have a word in their brain already, they know the word, they know how it's supposed to be pronounced, then when they're reading that word, it's easier for them to decode that word, because they already know it, and they can flex the vowel sounds or whatever. So if that's something you're doing with your child, continue it, keep it up, keep looking for books that might be just at or above their reading level, even for the younger ones, and speaking with your child. So this is outside of letters or words or anything. The younger ones especially, that talk, just having those conversations, the back and forth, and just really encouraging them to keep going. I think that's so huge, and that isn't always focused on enough, the oral language part of
Yeah.
it. I think if you talk to any speech language pathologist, they would tell you the same thing. um, and then, if your child is showing an interest in letters or showing an interest in sounds, you could start playing little like phonological awareness games with them, or doing some rhyming or something like that. Dr. Seuss books are great for those kinds of things, because the rhyming's kind of built in and you're reading. And then you can kind of almost assess, like, are they picking up on rhyming? Because if they are, then they're probably, that's a great sign. If they're not, then they're like 4 or 5. You might want to, it just might be something to watch out for. It might be something to keep in the back of your mind, um, for the future. And of course, so those phonological awareness, phonemic awareness games, you could say, what's the first sound you hear in sat, or, and keep building on that. And then,
We did, I was just say we did as kids when
yeah.
we did road trips, we did the animal game. And so somebody
Oh,
would say an animal, so like tiger, and then the next
mhm.
person would have to say something that an animal that started with the last letter that
Oh,
started with
wow.
the last letter. So tiger, and then you would have to use the R. So I do
Wow.
that with my kids now, but my kids like, I can't think of any more animals. Let's just use any word. So we use, which is
Yeah.
fine. Because
Right.
it's still, that's the idea of recognizing the first sound and
Mhm.
recognizing the last sound and connecting it. And
Right.
it's just so funny because I think back, I mean, because when I grew up, there really wasn't special ed or anything like that.
Yeah.
But this is something my parents did naturally, that we would play
Right.
in the car, like we would do that. And then we would do the rhyming, that we would just like, pay, what rhymes with pay, and pay, day, K, go
Yeah.
through the whole alphabet and
Right.
just,
And
and I do
that's,
that with my kids now, and then we'll just start laughing because we make up nonsense
yeah.
words,
It's
like because
so
it's
it's so fun for them. It's a game. They
right,
don't know that, you're actually targeting any specific skill, but I mean,
right.
I think too, like nursery rhymes, it used to be a lot more emphasis on nursery rhymes, and I think it's coming back,
Yes.
but they're great. And any kind of alliteration, like you were saying, or focusing on the first sound of a word, or and keeping it going, songs, those kinds of things, anything like that is great. And I will tell you that with my son, he's 5. And I think he's going to be a fine reader. It's just he's, like, not interested at all, and it's
Isn't that
very
frustrating?
frustrating. Yeah, I'm like,
Right?
"I'm a reading specialist, you have to be
Exactly.
interested, like, what's wrong with you?" But no, he just,
Yeah.
he's very much more into math. But I used, Lively Letters. It's something you can order. I don't know if you're familiar with it or if you've heard of
Yeah,
it,
I know
but,
that one.
so it's a program, and they sell it online. You can buy it online. They do a lot of pretty low cost trainings. So anyway, they're cards. They sell these cards where they have the letter, but it's there's like a character embedded in the letter to help them with the sound, and it's kind of all tied in, and then focusing on the sounds first instead of the letter name. So we've done a lot with that, and he really does enjoy that. They come with stories for each letter character, and it just really helps to cement the sound and then the letter. And then, of course, you can take that through to blending words and reading words. And I found that to be really fun and engaging for a child who really probably could care less, couldn't care
Right.
less at this point, you know? So
It's
it's a
it
fun program. Yeah.
as a former teacher, it kills me. It's like
I
I have one
know.
that loves going to school and one that hates school, and she
Yeah,
hates it.
they're so
I'm like, "How
different.
do you not like
Yeah,
school?" Right?
right. I
And
know.
it's funny because my younger one, she said to my husband a couple weeks ago, she's like, "Daddy, why do you always use such big words that I don't understand?" And he said, "Because I want to help develop your vocabulary. And she's like, oh, you know, like that was it. So now she's fine.
Yeah,
You know, but
yeah.
they,
Just wanted
I
to
mean,
know
that's the
why.
thing. Right. I used to, I mean, I always, when my kids were babies, I would flip out if somebody tried to talk baby talk with them because I'm like,
Oh,
do
really?
not
Yeah.
baby talk with a child. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Hmm.
they're not going to learn how to talk when you baby
Right.
talk. They know how to
Yeah.
do that, you know,
Yeah.
like, and that's the
Yeah.
thing. And it's that reading and just language rich environment
Absolutely. Yeah.
helps.
So important um, to lay
So
that
what are
foundation. So.
yeah. What are like what are some myths out there about reading instruction? I mean, well, clearly you've already busted one of them that reading specialists know how to teach special ed kids
I
reading,
know, that's a really unfortunate one. Yeah, I think
right?
it's getting better. I definitely think it's getting better.
Yeah,
Um, but it's funny, I think there's a lot, unfortunately, and sometimes I'm thinking, like, is this a myth, or do we just need more research to support this or, to refute it? Some things I think there just needs to be a little bit more research on, but, I mean, your audience might I think there's some myths here that they probably, well, perhaps they've heard this before or maybe not, but, one of the biggest ones I know when I was first learning, going into the science of reading, learning through Wilson and then eventually OG and everything, is that reading's not a natural process. When I was just going through school, like bachelor's degree in elementary education, that was not ever said to me. We just assumed reading was the same as speech, right? You pick up on
right,
speech naturally. You don't have to teach necessarily your child how to talk; they just pick it up because it's biologically ingrained, right? And reading is an invention humans invented, right? It hasn't even been around
yeah,
that long, and you can't just through osmosis, most kids can't through osmosis pick it up.
right,
So explicit phonics instruction is really needed for most kids. Of course, you have your outliers will they'll just pick it up no matter what, they'll pick it up. It's just all in, how their brains are wired essentially. But most kids will require that explicit teaching, and practice. So I think that was it seems like that's, becoming a myth that's more well known, and I think more and more people realize that that's not the case, but, that was just a huge one for me when I first started on this journey. Um, and then like you said, does your reading specialist or even your special education teacher might not be they
right,
might not be trained in the way that they need to be trained that's keeping up with the research in order to provide the best instruction, um, to students who struggle.
right.
So yeah, do you want me to keep going? I have
No,
there's quite a
sure.
few.
No, I was trying to think of like other ones that I know were busted for me, like, you know, just, but that's so true that it's not innate. Like you need to be taught.
Mhm.
I know one of the myths often is like, if your child's struggling in reading, you just need to make them read more.
Oh my gosh, yes, that's one that I
Right?
definitely have written down because I used to say that when I was a kindergarten
Right?
teacher,
Yeah.
and we would discuss in our team meetings like, "Oh, they just need to do it more," or they just need to,
Right.
like there's like 75 sight words they had to memorize in kindergarten. And I
Ugh,
remember I had one of our admin was like, "Well, I guarantee you, if you got paid to have these kindergartners learn their sight words, then you would be, if we paid you $1 million for these kids to learn their sight words, they would know them." And I'm like, "Really?"
right?
And now we know, of course, that that's so not true and
Right.
so not backed by science. But yeah, that was a big one. I definitely had
Yeah.
that written down.
And I remember
So
when I taught reading, so when I taught in elementary school in the inner city, they had started this new reading program. And we were like this pilot school. I don't even remember the name of it. It was so many decades ago. But I
yeah,
remember learning it and I was a reading specialist, I guess technically. Like I
yeah,
pulled out the kids and you would like reread the books and then once you passed on, you went to the other.
yeah.
Um, and when I noticed it was like a program that just wasn't going to work, is when my kid said, "Look, Miss Shefter, I can read the book without looking at the pages."
Oh, wow, yeah.
I was
That's
like,
a big clue.
okay,
Yeah.
memorize the book, which makes
Mhm,
sense because you hear the
mhm.
same book over and over. You
Right.
memorize it. You're not
Mhm.
reading it. You're
Right.
memorizing what you hear.
Exactly. Yeah, there's no tie to the print there. My 2-year-old does that, she just hears it and memorizes it. It's just,
Right. Or look at the picture and tell their own story.
yeah, exactly. Guess. Just take a guess. I
So what other
know.
myths you got?
Okay, so I definitely had that one that we just discussed. Reading more is the answer. No. I guess this one is more specific to kind of like what I do. So I'm an Orton-Gillingham practitioner, or I teach through the Orton-Gillingham approach. It's not a program; it's an approach. But some people
Which is a myth
have,
in itself.
yeah.
That's
Well,
another.
some people.
Everybody thinks it's a specific program, and it's not. It's an
Exactly.
approach,
Yes. Yes,
right?
exactly. I mean, there's some programs that are aligned to it, which would be
Right.
considered programs, but that's not what Orton-Gillingham is. Like it's not scripted. It's a lot of training, but a lot of people think that it is just phonics. And I think, maybe if you have someone who isn't maybe as well trained, or someone who is just kind of going off the fly, maybe just providing phonics, and okay, that's what they're doing. But the approach itself is very comprehensive in that it includes, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, all of those things. And, I think another myth that kind of ties into that is that those skills need to be taught separately, or outside of each other, but they really have to be interwoven and interconnected to make the most of it for a child, to help them really build those sight words and keep them in their brains, and propel them forward. And it's my opinion that Orton Gilling that approach does a good job with that, interweaving all of those concepts and not teaching them as separate entities, but kind of building it all up
Which
as
makes
one, which
sense.
is, yeah.
Because what we talked about before is that the reason dyslexia is not picked up earlier in schools is because a lot of times they can do the individual parts. It's
Hmm.
being able to
Hmm.
do them all together that the dyslexic child has the issue.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't you be teaching with all of the parts together,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that application,
Yeah.
really having that application. Um, yeah. So, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but your school administration knows best.
Oh,
I
geez.
think when you
School
go
knows
in,
best, period.
I know, right? I know. I mean, I think when you go in, you just kind of assume, well, these people are in leadership roles. And I mean, there are wonderful administrators out there and wonderful teachers out there who really do want to do the best for their students. And I don't want to like lump them all into one category, but first of all, if you're a parent and you suspect that something is wrong, it probably is. I've
Correct.
never encountered a situation where a parent thought that something was off and they were wrong. They're always right. You know your kid, and admin can come and tell you, well, these scores are average, they're fine, they're not, they're reading okay. And it's like, but
Yeah.
right? And so you have to kind of trust your gut as a parent and realize that the school admin doesn't know all the time. They don't.
And they
Yeah.
can't. And the
No.
teachers don't know all the time. They can't, and
Right.
I say that,
Yeah.
it's not, they're not doing it maliciously. It's not like they don't
No.
want to teach your child. It's not like they don't want to help.
Yeah.
It's just they only have so much they can do.
Right.
Um, and they only have so much training because like
Mhm.
gen ed teachers aren't given any special ed training. They're not given how to recognize and how to do a quick little assessment of,
Right.
simple things that we learned with special ed training.
Yeah. Right.
Um, which is so crazy because it's the gen ed teachers that need to be like the search team, in child,
Mhm.
they're the first.
I don't even think, and I'm speaking from my own experience as well here. So yeah, I don't think that they're super equipped to deal with the IEPs either, because as a general ed teacher, you weren't trained in how to construct an IEP or what the IEP goals mean. And, I worked in a school recently where the child would have an IEP, student teachers wouldn't even know. And if they did know, they didn't check up on the IEP and make sure that, they're focusing on these goals, or they would be able to have students with a specific learning disability or dyslexia, and they would be having them read, a science test or a social studies test. And it's like, no, there this isn't assessing what they know. You're assessing their decoding ability. And
Right,
it's specifically outlined that tests are supposed to be read to them. And you're not following the IEP, maybe because you don't know to do that, or because you're not aware of even where to find it. I mean, I just think that there's a lot of things that should, I think, be more overlapped between special ed and general ed and reading specialists, like you were saying earlier, because we all have the same goal essentially to help these kids. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's frustrating because I get that a lot is that the IEP is not being implemented. The
Yeah.
teachers didn't even know. Like, I mean, I've had teachers like actually in writing email clients and be like, your child has turned in the last 5 assignments 2 days late. And it's like, yes, the IEP says my child can turn
That's
in the
okay.
assignments 2 days
Right.
late.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of their accommodations,
Yeah.
and, like, clearly you don't have the IEP,
That's a
which
dead
and again
giveaway. Yeah.
right, and again, like, this is a middle school, high school teacher, which they know their content, they're not even necessarily totally taught teaching skills,
Right.
they have 30 kids in their class, 40 kids in their class, to know all the IEPs,
It's
that's
very
not
difficult.
yeah,
Mhm.
I don't put that on the teacher, I put that on whoever the special ed coordinator is to make sure the teachers all have the support that they need,
Right.
or
Yeah.
administration, which that's a whole 'nother story. 'Cause
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I say it always, like, how the principal or even assistant principals, the administrative staff, how they look at special education is, like, a huge determiner
Right.
of what the special ed department's gonna look like and what
Yeah.
support's gonna look like.
It's
I've had schools that were, like, top of the list schools, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, this is the great special ed school." Principal changed, and, like, all of a
mhm.
sudden, like, "Holy crap, what just
Right.
happened?" You
That's
know?
right. It changes the whole dynamic and the whole outlook of everything.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, so
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Um,
it is.
but
And
right.
so I wanna talk a little bit more about what you do and how you do it. So
Sure.
I think you said, like, with OG that you start with an assessment?
Mhm.
Or was
Yeah.
that you so what does that look like? So if somebody says, "Alright, I think my kid has dyslexia, I need help. What do I do? What do I ask for? How can you help?"
Sure. So I think the first place to start, if possible, would be with like a psychoeducational eval, and that's not always possible, but that is where you get like the cognitive testing, working memory, processing speed, and all of those underlying subtests, like we had talked about, that kind of give a clearer picture. And I don't do that, right? I'm not a psychologist or anything, but what I do is once I get a child, whether they have dyslexia or not, I can work with them. They don't necessarily need a diagnosis, but my first step is always like a diagnostic assessment. But I'm only assessing, well, all of those like comprehensive reading skills, but I'm not going into, like I said, the cognitive piece of it, just basically reading. So we know they have a reading issue somewhere. The purpose of the diagnostic test is for me to figure out where that issue is and where strengths and weaknesses, and then where I can begin. The best place to begin for the student that's not too low but not too high, so that we can begin at the right pace and at the right level for the student. So
Right, so that's great. And then are you in person or virtual or both?
right now, I'm only virtual. We are moving. My husband and I were moving, and where we're moving has an office space, and so my hope
Nice.
is to bring students in person because I mean I love teaching online. I really do think you can do pretty much anything online that you can do in person, but in person is, of course, like I mean, if I had to choose, I would want to be in person if I could. I just don't have the space right now, but so yeah, I do both
Makes sense.
eventually.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's so funny because I always think like, how the heck do you teach reading without being next to the kid reading? I guess you each have your own copy of the book or something, right? Or
Yes, or it's taken a lot of, adaptation. Of course, COVID helped in that aspect. It helped a lot
I know,
because
I
you
say it all the time. I hate saying it
yeah,
helped, but
I know it's terrible. I know. But in that aspect, it did because you were forced to adapt and learn different strategies, learn different programs, and really just the Zoom tools of sharing the screen is it seems so simple, but I can put whatever text I need to on the screen and share it. I also have a document camera, so I can share that. So, it's not the same as seeing it in person, but they're still able to read we're still able to read the same words or share the screen and, do much of the same things that we would do if we were in person. And,
and as a
I forget the
parent,
name.
I'm thinking if it wasn't a tutor coming into my house, which is its own other thing of like, oh wait, my house needs to be clean enough for somebody to come
Yeah.
into.
Right. Yeah.
Straighten everything up and clear off the table.
Yeah.
And then the thought of driving the kids, like I got to get this one to this and this one to that and this one to
Right.
the other. It's rough. So
Right.
virtual, like kind of, I only have to carve out an hour, like period,
Right.
an hour, you know.
Yeah. There's
Is that
definitely benefits to it. And I think too,
yeah,
I have I'm have mixed feelings about the real young students. Like I don't think I would take on a kindergartner online
right,
personally. I know other teachers who do, and they probably do just fine, but I'm not comfortable with that. I think that in person for them is much better. So many
right,
of my students are second grade and above, and they really do Zoom. It's almost like it's intuitive for them. Many of them, I sometimes I do go through like a tutorial of like, this is where the annotation tool is. This is where, this, whatever other button they need they need is the mute
right.
button or whatever. We might have to do that, but many of the older students already know how to work it and they're pretty adept. And yeah, it's a lot of the same things that you would do in
Yeah.
person. Of course,
And how,
I can send parents things to print so that they do have it, if they prefer that. I'm always like, I don't want to give the parents something extra to do, but
right,
then their eyes aren't on the screen. So it is possible to do that. It's just one more step. So,
right. That
you
makes
know.
sense. And so
Mhm.
do you, I know you said something about having a certificate, but do you, are you just with Pennsylvania students or is it you can teach anywhere?
Well, online I can teach anywhere. Yeah. It's not like speech pathology, I think, where you have to have like a license in a certain state to serve those
Right.
students. Because it's my own private practice, I can I'm tutoring. I used to tutor two children in Oregon, the brother and a sister. Now I'm only tutoring the brother, but it's a 3-hour time difference. So, I'm tutoring at like 7 and it's, 4 o'clock his time and it works pretty well actually. So, yeah, different time zones, different places, you know, whatever
No, that's
works.
awesome. That is so
Yeah.
awesome. This has been so great. I love it. And like dyslexia
Yeah,
is just such a hot thing, right? Topic right
it
now. It's
is.
one of the big ones. Um,
Mhm.
because it's again, it's not getting picked up early enough. And then where are you?
Right. Right.
It's almost,
Yeah.
and if a child is above fourth grade, I always say, you know what? Go hire a tutor. Go
Right.
find a good tutor that's trained. You want
Right.
Wilson or OG. I know I've heard both of them that
Yeah.
knows what they're doing, has had the training, has a
Yeah.
certificate, check into all of that stuff,
Yeah.
because they're going to be able to get your child where your child needs to be
Right.
without missing, content.
Exactly. And don't wait. And
Exactly.
no fault on the teachers at all, but many of these dyslexic students do need that one-on-one. They just really do. And you can't
Yeah.
replace. You just That's irreplaceable, really, for a
Right.
student that needs help. So
And so if people are listening and they want to get in touch with you and like, oh, wait, maybe we should have her at least do a diagnostic. What's
yeah.
the best way for people to reach you?
Well, I do. I have my website, so that's just www.writestartreading.com, and there's like a place on the website where you can send me a message or something. And then I have my email, Sarah@writestartreading.com, Sarah with an H. And I do have an Instagram, which if you, I think, just search Right Start Reading, it should come up, or Sarah at Right Start
We'll
Reading,
have
I
right.
think.
We'll have all the links in the show notes. So when
Those
we
are the
fully
places.
publish it, yeah.
Yeah, that's where
Uh,
you can contact me. Yeah.
yeah. So awesome. This has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I love collaborating with like-minded people, and this has been a great experience. So thank you so much.
You've been listening to Stress-Free IEP with your host, Francis Shefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Francis through shefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.